Good morning, guys. Welcome back. Welcome back to today's U.S. history lesson. If you are just joining us today, my name is Tanika Farr. I am at Cambridge High School in Milton, Georgia, by way of Atlanta. And if you have been with us the entire time, I'm so happy to see you guys. So, for today's virtual lesson, we are going to talk about the civil rights movement and other liberation rights movement that were inspired by the civil rights movement. Now, let me go ahead and give the caveat to everyone. I really wish I would be able to go and kind of dig more in depth with the civil rights movement. But today I'm just going to kind of give a brief overview, but I will provide you with some resources that you can use to kind of help you understand the civil rights movement, the people that were involved, several of the events that took place, as well as the organizations that were a part of this. But just for today, we're going to kind of go through and give a brief overview for everything. So let's just kind of go and talk about the lesson overview. So for the civil rights movements, these are topics 8.6, 8.10, and 8.11. Our expectations today are we're going to explain how and why the civil rights movement developed and expanded from 1945 to 1960. We're also going to look at how and why various groups responded to the calls for the expansion of the civil rights from 1960 to 1980. We're going to also look at how the transition from how it started in the 50s into how it transitioned from each decade, how the movement and the tone of the movement kind of changed. And then we're going to explain how and why various groups responded for calls from the 1960s to 1980s, kind of looking at those liberation right movements and kind of seeing how what African Americans were doing in the 40s and the 50s kind of inspired those other movements to come about. So, from the past few lessons, you guys have learned about contextualization, you have learned about various things such as sourcing and situation. So, now we're going to kind of look at how these new skills about making connections, also to identify patterns among patterns among or connections between historical developments and processes. We're also going to explain how historical developments or processes relates to another historical development or process. So let's just go ahead and get started with our warm up. So when Mr. Horton last left off, he kind of talked about for you to think about this. What were the goals and strategies of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey with regard to the civil rights movement? Now, let me kind of set the stage a little bit. Everyone assumes or thinks that the civil rights movement kind of started with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. However, civil rights was something that was fought right at the end of Reconstruction, so right around with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, when a lot of African Americans who had gotten some rights and had acquired these rights back with the 15th Amendment. And now what's going to happen is you're going to start to see that when these rights kind of came about at the end of Reconstruction, when the Union withdrew soldiers, a lot of African Americans lost some of those civil liberties. And so this is when these gentlemen are going to kind of come about. And kind of think about it like this. As you guys are listening to the lesson, don't forget you can tweet your questions to @virtualapush. So thinking about that, what would be the goals and the strategies of these three gentlemen? Well, first and foremost, we're going to start with Booker T. Washington. He had a strong belief that Blacks should assimilate in the world of work by learning technical skills. He will also go on later to found the Tuskegee University, which was a vocational school which was set about to teaching African Americans how to have these certain skills that would make them invaluable to society. He realized that a lot of these newly freed African Americans were former slaves. Some of them had already had skills that most people did not have. And so he felt that by doing hard work and just showing that they can actually be valuable citizens would be more value versus demanding rights. W.E.B. Du Bois, he contended that Blacks should receive liberal arts education. He was the very first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. He will later actually go on to teach at Tuskegee University, as well as he will teach at a college in Atlanta. And the unique thing about him was the fact that he honestly felt that Blacks should go ahead and demand their rights, that they have nothing more to prove, that these were civil liberties that were put into place thanks to the Constitution, especially with the 14th Amendment. And so therefore there should be no belief that they should assimilate into the world. And then you have Marcus Garvey, who was actually not even born in the United States. He was from Jamaica. He had immigrated here, and he had a belief that Blacks should return to Africa. He had a movement called Garveyism. It was a very strong movement. Um, he felt that during that time, with Blacks kind of returning to Africa, that they should pretty much just kind of go back to where their roots started from. He did actually build some boats, and the theory was that all the African Americans that were in the United States at that time, they were going to get on these boats and go back to Africa and build their own societies. Unfortunately for him, he was actually arrested, and he was pushed back to Jamaica. He was left broke and destitute. And those people who were a part of that movement, some actually did return back to Africa, but the movement slowly died down. So I want you to kind of think about these three gentlemen, because we're going to see them kind of reincarnated again when the movement starts in the 50s and the 60s. So here's what you need to know. All right, so let's just kind of talk about some of the organizations that were a part of the civil rights movement that had major roles. The first one is going to be the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as the NAACP. One of its founders was W.E.B. Du Bois, and they were an organization that helped fight a lot of legal battles. They are very prominent. They had offices set up in major cities, especially in the South and some places in the North. Their jobs were to pretty much use the law against those who were trying to prohibit African Americans from having their civil liberties in order to fight for justice. They had a lot of major cases, including Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Other prominent people who are part of that organization would be Thurgood Marshall, who actually argued that case and would later go on to become the first African American Supreme Court justice. Then you have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. You probably have heard of this organization or its president, which was Martin Luther King Jr. This was comprised of various Southern Baptist churches, its leaders, because one of the things that they realized during the movement was that if they wanted to get momentum, if they wanted to get their message out there, that it was going to be the church. The church was a staple inside of a lot of African American neighborhoods. Ministers and preachers were seen as leaders within the community. And so they felt like they needed to capitalize upon that and come about and use this organization. The SCLC probably had its biggest branch inside of Atlanta, Georgia. This was headquarters here in Atlanta for one of the biggest SCLC offices, which is where Martin Luther King was from. But they had them in places like Mississippi and Alabama. Birmingham would be a good example of that. And again, Tennessee, South Carolina, anywhere where there was injustice being done, the SCLC had offices there. Then you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC. They were not actually a part with the SCLC. They were mostly comprised of college students. Their portion of the movement is really going to kind of come in the latter part of the 60s, probably around 62, 63. They're going to kind of pick up where some of the SCLC did not come through. One of the biggest things that they were kind of going to be known for was picking up the Freedom Rides when CORE, who was the first group who started the Freedom Rides, they're going to kind of pick up that pace and kind of continue on. People like Diane Nash, like Stokely Carmichael, and you will notice that Stokely Carmichael will start off being nonviolent if you go deeper into his studies, and then he'll kind of turn away from that and kind of move in with the Black Panther Party. And then, of course, I just mentioned CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality. One of its members was James Meredith. And again, they were the group who kind of started the Freedom Summers with the Freedom Rides, kind of going through testing the boundaries of the 14th Amendment in various places to see if African Americans were going to be denied their civil rights. And other things they're going to kind of arrange were going to be sit-ins and et cetera. So here are just some of the people. And again, like I said, this is just a brief overview. This is not even the beginnings of the amount of people who had an impact within the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, the woman who was known for not giving up her seat on the bus. Interesting fact about that. While she was a secretary of the NAACP office inside of Montgomery, Alabama, she was actually not the first person they chose to actually do that. There was another young lady whose case that they were looking at, because what the whole premise behind this was, they wanted to choose people who had their rights violated. It would be newsworthy, because that was the important thing about the movement, was that they wanted to have direct action, but they wanted it to be televised. They wanted newspapers to write about it so that the world will know what was happening inside of these cities inside of the southern states. And so there was a young lady, she was 15 years old, and she was pregnant. And the exact same incident happened with her. Pregnant girl asked to give up her seat, and she refused, and she was arrested. And the NAACP thought her case was going to make a great kind of moniker, kind of like this was it. This was going to be the case that's going to set us apart. Unfortunately, when they looked at her police arrest record, the police wrote down that she had committed aggravated assault, and so therefore her case could not be used, which is why they decided to use Rosa Parks. So a lot of people don't even know about that young lady, but she was actually going to be the face of the movement at that time. But unfortunately for her, when they put down that she committed aggravated assault, that kind of went ahead. They had to throw that case out the window. Martin Luther King Jr., you guys have probably studied him since elementary school. Leader of the SCLC, will eventually become the face of the movement, especially during the 60s. Freedom Riders, these are groups of people. They were college students, they were Black, they were white, they were old, they were young, they were ministers, they were everyday common people, risking their lives, riding the bus, going through these southern cities, very dangerous. Territories in which they embarked upon, and again, testing to see if they would receive service in certain areas that had, segregation was still being practiced. And they did this after the infamous 1945 decision of Brown versus Board of Education, which basically just said that segregation was illegal. Malcolm X, who would become a part of the movement in the late 60s, kind of will remind you of Marcus Garvey. Honestly believed that, fighting for rights right then versus trying to assimilate. He did not actually believe in desegregation. He thought that Blacks and whites should actually remain separate. His biggest things were fighting for their rights now, supporting Black businesses within their own neighborhoods. And then later, his mind will change once he does kind of take his pilgrimage back to Mecca, and he realizes that his tactics of, having, by any means necessary kind of acts will actually kind of set the movement back. And also, too, he did have a meeting with Martin Luther King Jr. No one knows what was said during that meeting, but it said that the meeting of the minds between the two gentlemen, they kind of came to an agreement and kind of an understanding of each other. The Black Panther Party kind of modeled themselves after many of the things that Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. Stokely Carmichael will later become a member of this, Bobby Seals. Um, excuse me, and also Huey Newton. And they were very big as far as laws, pretty much kind of started their bases out in California. They were the more aggressive. When they came about towards the late 60s, early 70s, they're going to be a little bit more aggressive as far as their tactics. They did not believe in nonviolence. However, they did have a lot of drives where they, sent books out to children. They also fed children during breakfast in the morning. So they did a lot of good, but they are going to be the target of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI during that time. And then the Kerner Commission, I left that definition in there for you guys because this was a commission that was created by President Johnson, and this was after Kennedy was assassinated. And this was happening around 1967. And there were a lot of race riots that kind of took place during that time, and he wanted to know why. So he formed this commission to kind of go out into these various cities, especially up north where a lot of the riots were taking place, to find out exactly why these African Americans were rioting, what were the frustrations. And of course, one of the biggest things they found out was due to economic opportunity. Uh, Unfortunately for the African Americans, a lot of the report was ignored by Johnson in 1967, but that will all change in 1968. So here are some, again, just some of the events that took place during the movement. Jim Crow laws that were established to kind of circumvent the 13th and the 14th Amendment, especially the 14th Amendment, which basically gave former slaves the right to citizenship, which basically just says they now have civil liberties. Jim Crow laws were basically put into place in order to say, okay, we have to acknowledge that the 14th Amendment exists, but we don't have to coexist with them. So when you see pictures, or if you've seen movies where they have whites and they had one water fountain for whites and they had another one for coloreds, or they had waiting rooms, or they had bathrooms, etc., this is where Jim Crow laws were founded from. The Little Rock Nine, this was after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, which is after that. This was the first group in Little Rock, Arkansas, to kind of go into Central High School and to integrate. Unfortunately, they were not able to do that on the first day. Governor Faubus actually sent in the National Guard to prevent them from doing that. And so Eisenhower had to intervene and basically had them escorted. And so every day they had to get, for the first year, they had to get military escorts into school every day. Brown versus Board of Education. A little known fact about this is not just a single case. This was actually a class action lawsuit. It was actually 3 cases in one. It just so happened that the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas was the largest board of education. And so they're going to be kind of the face for this. And this was the case of Linda Brown, who could attend a school that was close by, but she actually had to be bused to a different school because of that. You have the Greensboro sit-ins, the case of the 4 young gentlemen who started this in Greensboro, South Carolina, who went into a luncheon counter to see if they would get service. And they would actually set the precedence for future sit-ins that will be performed by the Freedom Riders. They would also do that. Yes, they were arrested. Yes, they were pretty much risking their lives, which they knew that. But again, this was going to kind of spark more and more sit-ins to happen during that time. The Montgomery bus boycott, which is again started because of what happened to Rosa Parks. This took place for more than a year, and this was one of the biggest, I guess, one of the penultimate events for Martin Luther King with this. Unfortunately, you will see some kind of points in the movement where things will kind of die down, but this was huge, where African Americans refused to ride the bus for a year, and they figured out other ways to kind of circumvent that by giving each other rides, by riding bikes, by walking. And of course, they kind of made an impact with that. The letter from the Birmingham jail when Martin Luther King was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, was kind of a response to clergymen who had some questions for Martin Luther King of, why are you doing this? Why all the nonviolence? What would be the point of this? And as they're kind of going through and doing this, kind of looking at the fact that these were things that were happening. The ballot or the bullet speech, which was given by Malcolm X, kind of talking about by any means necessary, looking at those things that were happening during that time, and again, kind of talking about demanding your rights right then versus waiting for your rights to kind of, for them to kind of give in. The March on Washington, we've known that, we've seen that, which is where the I Have a Dream speech kind of came into place. And another fact about that, that was not the first time that a March on Washington was proposed. A. Philip Randolph actually promised that as a part of the Brotherhood for the Traveling Porter, which was done way back right before World War II. And that was actually stopped thanks to FDR because he made some changes. So we talked about letter from the Birmingham jail, and I wanted you to kind of look at this and kind of briefly read through the excerpt when he was talking about answering the question of why direct action, and kind of thinking about his point of view, kind of thinking about why he decided to do this and why he was, kind of going on that path for advocates. So I'll give you a few seconds to read that. Okay, with King's excerpt from this, I want you to know that this was actually written on several pieces of paper that had to, be smuggled outside of the jail because King was not allowed to respond to any types of letters or anything like that. So people who would come in to visit him, he would write this response out on little sheets of paper, paper towels, toilet paper, whatever he could find to draft this letter. And once they put it together, it will become known as the letter from the Birmingham jail. And basically kind of talking about adopting the ideals of Gandhi with civil disobedience, kind of talking about that they have a moral responsibility to disobey, and that when laws are unjust, that people have a right to fight for those rights. And this letter would actually inspire a lot more clergy to kind of answer. It was kind of like him saying, we need a call to action. You guys need to respond to this. And if you can't respond, then we're going to kind of go ahead and take actions in our own hand. We understand that you don't agree with us, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to fight for our civil liberties. And so I want you guys to kind of see this that kind of talks about the March on Washington and where the inspiration came from.
In the wake of Birmingham and the president's proposed civil rights legislation, Negro leaders announced a mass march to galvanize nationwide support for civil rights. For decades, this had been the dream of labor leader A. Philip Randolph.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality. Social, economic, and political. No force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
Randolph first raised the idea of a mass march in 1941 when he used it as a threat to encourage President Franklin Roosevelt to end segregation in federal government agencies and among defense contractors. 20 years later, Randolph's dream became reality. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom would be the greatest mass protest in the nation's history.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Thousands set off for the nation's capital to show their support for civil rights. They came by car, by bus, by rail, from LA and San Francisco, from Cleveland and Chicago, from Jackson and Birmingham.
Okay, so you can kind of see that this movement sparked a lot of people to come about. As far as legislation, probably the two biggest legislations or wins for the civil rights movement is going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was actually promised prior to Kennedy's assassination. Once he saw what happened with the kids in Birmingham in the Children's March and the use of water hoses and everything like that, he was actually going ahead and getting ready to sign this. But unfortunately for him, he was assassinated in 1963. And so Lyndon B. Johnson, who was vice president at the time, took over and went ahead and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it is going to be a landmark civil rights law that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, nationality, religion, and sex, and prohibited racial segregation. So it pretty much did everything that Brown versus the Board of Education did, but now this was actually a more solid law. And this was not the first time that Lyndon B. Johnson had tried to put a Civil Rights Act into place. He actually fought for one in the 1950s. Unfortunately, it did not pass. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which basically was a result of the infamous march in Selma, which basically made literacy tests illegal, and it also prohibited states from denying U.S. citizens the right to vote on the basis of race. And again, that whole Selma to Montgomery marches really did contribute to its passing. Another major civil rights law that I could bring into place that I didn't actually list, but again, it's a part of the movement, is going to be the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which basically prohibits discrimination from people based on the basis of races, from being able to being denied the right to fill out housing applications. So, like I said, this is just a brief overview of the civil rights movement for African Americans. I want you guys to take a and scan either the QR code or if you can take a picture with your phones of this website. This is what I call the ABCs of the civil rights movements. It's going to kind of take you through. And as you're kind of looking at it, if there are names that you don't recognize, feel free to Google or look through your textbook, your A-Push textbook, and kind of look at some of those people and kind of look at the names and read about some of the events that they participated in. Again, this is just a small sample of the individuals who had a part of the movement. So I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds to take whatever pictures you need to take. Okay, great. Now let's talk about other movements. So this is the other part of the topics we're going to kind of cover. So the civil rights movement again had started in the 1950s and moved into the 60s and the 70s. And it wasn't just about racial discrimination against African Americans. It was about racial discrimination against minorities such as Asians, Native Americans, Latinos. We're even going to get into gay and lesbian rights, and we're also going to talk about feminism. And so this is a part of the Latino movement known as the grape growers. And I like to refer to this as a struggle in the fields because we had a huge population of immigrants that were coming in from Mexico that found themselves in jobs that were pretty much rough. It was kind of like they were working in these grape fields and they weren't treated fairly. They weren't paid fairly. They had disgusting conditions. And so they're going to have their own leader, and his name is going to be Cesar Chavez. And it kind of talks about his efforts to organize the farm workers in the Central Valley of California. He's going to look at what the movement and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and kind of take those same ideas and form his own kind of movement. They are going to unionize. It's going to be a major part. It's going to be himself and Dolores Huerta. They're going to kind of be seen as the two leaders of this movement. And the one thing they wanted to kind of talk about was they did the same things. You're going to notice when you start to study this, they did strikes. They encourage people to not buy certain items. They only encourage people to buy certain fruit that was actually supported by their union. If it had a certain seal on there, they were safe. Everybody else, they should kind of boycott that. They boycotted where they wouldn't even go into work. They would refuse to work. They did fasts. Cesar Chavez did major fasts, kind of like Gandhi, kind of mirroring that, where until certain rights were heard by the government inside of California to change the labor laws to make it fair, where they would get fair wages, where they would get fair treatment. Where they wouldn't have to work into harsh conditions, where they're working around pesticides and weren't given protective gear, where they were inhaling all of these harmful and pesticides that were getting into their bloodstream and causing them to get sick. And they too took a pilgrimage, kind of looking at the March on Washington, looking at the march from Selma to Montgomery, and they actually did a march from within their area all the way up to Sacramento, and it was taking days. And during that time, when they were taking the pilgrimage to Sacramento, Cesar Chavez was doing his own version of a fast, and it kind of talks about nonviolence. It talks about the importance of faith and prayer, and of course, achieving his goal. And he was very successful. So Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta would kind of be like their leaders of their movement, or the Martin Luther Kings of that time. Other movements that we can kind of put notice in would be the Yellow Power movement. And this was about Asian Americans. And this was actually stemming from everything that happened to them after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when these Japanese internment camps were built based off that executive order from FDR. When Japanese Americans, many who might have been first generation or second generation who were born here, were placed in these internment camps and said that they were put there for their own safety. But of course, we later found out that they had civil rights that were stripped from them, especially with the infamous Korematsu versus the United States. And so during the 60s and the 70s, they're going to actually fight for rights too. One of the biggest things they wanted to be known for was ethnic study programs in universities. They wanted to make sure that people understood their role inside of history. For example, the fact that had it not been for Japanese immigrants, the Transcontinental Railroad would not have been built. And yet, and still, when you look at pictures from during that time, a lot of the Japanese immigrants that were here were not pictured, where they were not photographed. You were looking at the facts of how they had the most dangerous part of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. They also fought about the end of Vietnam War. During the 60s, it was kind of a tumultuous time, a lot of protests that were taking place. And also, too, they were looking at reparations for anybody who was a part of the internment camps, who had their rights stripped, who had their businesses that were vandalized. They pretty much, Asian Americans who were on college campuses, especially within the state of of California on the West Coast, which is where a lot of Asian Americans who immigrated from, over from Japan, from China, from wherever they came from. This is going to kind of be their first point of settlement as they kind of went and, moved and migrated further into the United States. But they wanted their curriculum expanded. They wanted to be a part of American history, and they were just so, and they deserve that. And so activists kind of looked at gentrification, about how their neighborhoods were destroyed after World War II, and about how the federal government did nothing to help Asian Americans once they came back to rebuild those businesses, and about how they were still kind of discriminated against. How they had, things spray painted on their homes, on their businesses, Japs go home, things like that. And so this movement actually went well into the 80s. And so a lot of people, this is one of those movements that a lot of people don't really know about, but it is a part of our history, and it was inspired because of what was happening with African Americans, and they realized that they too needed to fight for their own rights as well. Another important movement to kind of bring up, kind of going along with the Red Power movement, and this was referring to Native Americans. And the Red Power movement was something that really, when you think about it, if you look back at everything that you've learned within history, it was fought well a long time ago. I would probably say give it around some of the time when Andrew Jackson was president. Um, Native Americans have been trying to fight for the rights to maintain land, things that were promised to them in various documents that were ignored, to the point where they were pushed onto reservations. Some things that you got to understand is that Native Americans were had the highest point of alcoholism because of this. They had their pretty much all their identity stripped away from them. They pretty much were forced to assimilate. Children were taken away and sent to boarding schools. They were told that they could no longer speak their own languages, but they played some very pivotal roles. When you think about it, for example, in World War II, the Navajos, their language has never been broken, and yet those they kept secrets and had a lot of things that were put into their language, and it was very important that those Navajo translators actually made it, because they actually held certain secrets that were very important, and they had to make it to their destination. And so their movement had a dual goal. Number one, becoming American citizens, being recognized, because even though when you think about it, and you think about the different amendments that were put into place, it did not include Native Americans. They were disincluded from all of that. And then, of course, sovereign rights of Native nations. In other words, they wanted to be recognized from their nations. They wanted certain land back. They wanted to be able to speak their own language. They wanted those same civil liberties and rights that were put inside of the Bill of Rights to be applicable to them. And they wanted to also maintain that loss of culture that they had. And so their leaders would include people like Dennis Banks, George Mitchell, Clyde Bellencourt. They're going to kind of convene in places like Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they're going to form AIM, the American Indian Movement. And they're going to kind of talk about, the frustrations of discrimination, about housing, about poverty, about all the things that were plaguing Native Americans during that time, and how to get those rights back. And so, again, the Red Power movement is very important for Native Americans. And what they realized is that some things they were really going to have to get into. They're going to have to get into positions of power. They are going to be successful in getting a senator elected, and they are going to get several local positions and state positions as well. This is the gay liberation movement that happened in the 50s, that kind of talks about discriminations against gays and lesbians. Very successful movement. People like Harvey Milk, who's going to be one of the first elected official within local government. But a lot of these kind of talks about, these organizations kind of talks about gay, lesbian, transgender activists who fought for criminalization, discrimination, things about sexual and gender identities. Some of these things that, were started out in the 1960s, where they were pretty much had to hide their identities, and they did not feel like doing that. They also kind of talked about how They looked at a lot of the struggles that they had employed, some of the strategies of protest and litigation. So kind of using the things that happened within the civil rights movement, and also using some of the tactics of the NAACP to kind of employ that. Probably one of the biggest things that happened during the gay liberation movement is going to be the Stonewall riots, which was a case of police brutality inside of a gay bar. That happened inside of New York City. And the riots kind of broke out. And so that's going to kind of put them on the forefront as well. And again, it is going to be very, very successful. You are going to see a lot of from the gay liberation movement, kind of looking at people who are going to be able to serve in certain offices in order to fight for rights for lesbian, transgender, and gay rights for individuals. And then last but not least, women's rights. Feminism kind of coming back. Remember, it happened in the 1920s with the flappers. Then it kind of died down a little bit with women kind of taking back those traditional roles. But the role of feminism still kind of, continued on. People like Betty Friedan with the feminine mystique. And then it's going to pick up again in the 70s with Gloria Steinem. And during the 70s, they're going to kind of talk about things that women were dealing with, things like abortion rights, women's shelters, battered women who were in marriages where they were being, again, discrimination in that way. You're going to look at women who were trying to work who were pregnant. They're going to look at rape laws. They're going to look at domestic violence. They're going to look at sexist stereotypes about how women were placed into certain jobs and were told that these were the only jobs that they were going to be able to have, and kind of changing those roles. And again, one of the good things about the women's rights is that you did actually have your first female superhero. Does anybody, and if anybody can go to AP at virtual A Push and tell me who is going to be the superhero that's going to come about because of all the things that happen within the women's rights. And I'll read Twitter in a few minutes and see if anybody's able to guess it. All right, guys. So again, like I said, it's just a brief overview. This is not all, but I wanted to make sure that we mention all of the different movements. So I want to make sure that we have some understanding. So let's do a little bit of guided practice. Okay, so take a few minutes and read this excerpt. This is from the Southern Declaration on Integration. This happened on March 11th, 1956. So this was 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education. So take a few minutes. Okay, and so which landmark development largely ended the possibility of support for the author's goal as outlined in the quote above? The answer is B, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And looking at Twitter to see who actually got it correct, the answer is actually Wonder Woman. So congratulations. It looks like Liliana Arias would be the first person to answer that correctly on Twitter. All right, guys, here's another question. Same excerpt, different question. The argument in the passage above is most clearly is most clearly a demand for the reinstatement of which prior historical development? Give you a few minutes. Okay, and the answer would be C, Plessy versus Ferguson. And of course, if you don't remember, Plessy versus Ferguson was the case that basically said that segregation was legal. All right, let's check for understanding just to make sure we're all on the same place. So if you have this question on your AP exam that says, some historians have argued between 1945 and 1980, African Americans made significant gains in social, political, and economic equality, and they told you to support, modify, refute this contention using specific evidence. Remember, we're talking about the idea of sourcing. What were some things that you could say? Well, you could talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which of course can be considered both social and political. Social because it did end segregation, political because of the fact that, again, it ended Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically says that segregation was illegal. You could use the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which again could be considered both social and political as well. I'm just kind of categorizing them in one group, even though they can kind of be applicable in two. You can use the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which of course ended voter discrimination. If again, it can be considered both political and social. And then economic, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So again, just because I put these categories down does not again mean that they cannot be applicable in more than one. They can go to both areas, but if you just wanted to kind of go ahead and kind of categorize them, this would be some way that you can do that. And then again, when you're talking about using specific evidence, make sure in your essays that you are explaining what each of these did and the impact that it made. All right, so let's just kind of debrief. So these are your key takeaways that you look up here about Reconstruction era promises not being fulfilled, about civil rights activists and political leaders, kind of looking at some of the legal and political successes, talking about Martin Luther King and combating racial discrimination, looking at Latino, American Indian, and the Asian American movements as they contended demand for social and economic, and looking at feminist and gay lesbian rights. So overview, pretty much we kind of talked about we did talk about African American civil rights from the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. We looked at the other liberation rights for Latino, Asian Americans, and that should be Native Americans, not Asian Americans twice. I apologize. And then we looked at the women and gay and lesbian movements. And so kind of looking at how all of these groups responded and why they responded. All right, so if I had a way to analyze the civil rights movement, I would kind of go into the 7 steps right here that you can see here. Looking at the causes, desegregation, things that happened in World War II, things that will be considered the spark, the Montgomery bus boycott, along with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. What will be considered the turning point of the movement, definitely police violence in Birmingham, and then the March on Washington. As far as democracy, was it achieved? No, because you saw police violence at Selma, talking about the right to vote. What will be the results? You have the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 65. The final stages of what would be the movement for African Americans, but not quite, would be in 68 with the Fair Housing Act, the Kerner Report, and unfortunately we have the assassination of Martin Luther King. And what would be the effects? It would inspire other groups to go ahead and fight for their political and social rights as well. Had a couple of questions from Twitter, and I can't remember who asked that question, but yes, you are correct. I was mistaken. Greensboro is actually in North Carolina, not South Carolina. So thank you for that question. Going to keep it moving, and I'll look at another Twitter question in just a moment. So here's another question. It says, for exam practice, between the 1960 and 1980 political debates sharply divided the nation. Identify 3 examples of clashes of power between of the presidency between 1960 and 1980. So we're looking at a series of different presidents from JFK all the way up into Reagan. So here are some potential answers that you can look at. A number of presidents use executive power to carry out acts. JFK used federal troops to protect the safety of the civil rights activists and the freedom rights of 1961. Could be a very good example of that. And again, we're listing 3 examples of that, but I'm only going to give you one for the sake of time. Part B of the short answer says, explain how one of the 3 examples in Part A led to a change in power for the presidency. Again, kind of talking about the executive branch protecting civil rights activists, provided the leverage needed for the movement to help affect real change. And it kind of led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So major as far as power of the presidency, really kind of forcing that in order to kind of not just making laws, but also protecting those laws and making sure that those laws are enforced. And then last but not least is part of C, one long-term effect of the change explained in part B for the power of the presidency. We kind of talk about the nation's laws, particularly the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those will be some major changes as far as the presidency is concerned. All right, really quickly, again, if you're having problems with the internet, you know somebody's having problems with the internet or device issues, please check in at cb.org/tech. Let them know directly. That's also applicable to teachers. If you have students that are complaining of issues or complaining of systems crashing, please go ahead and contact College Board directly so that they will know and they'll be able to take care of those things. All right, so something to think about for tomorrow. Kind of thinking about the point of views of Eisenhower and JFK as we continue kind of talking about the Cold War, because remember, even though the Civil Rights Movement was happening, Cold War is still happening outside of the American government as far as foreign issues. Take a few minutes and scan this QR code. This will actually give you a very beautiful, it's a great video that kind of goes more in depth for the Civil Rights Movement. And remember, again, this is just a brief overview. Was not able to kind of go into it as deeply as I would have loved to have gone into it with you guys, but I think this video combined with the ABCs will really give you guys what you needed to know about the Civil Rights Movement. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Have a great day.